In this tutorial I'm going to show you how to make this handy back of car seat storage with pockets for you to keep toys or magazines and drinks and things like that in. The top pocket is actually clear, so if you do have a tablet of any description you can see what's going on in there, and I've even left a little gap underneath the pocket so you can put your charger in there so it's not hanging out at the top. If you wanted to replace the clear pocket with a fabric pocket, just do exactly the same as the instructions for the bottom pocket, but put it across the top instead. And of course with the pockets you can put as many dividers down here as you like. So if you wanted to have a specific area for pens and then be another one for a water bottle and something else for toys, then that's entirely up to you. Now I've used a foam stabilizer behind here so it's nice and sturdy. It ties around the headrests with 2 ribbons, and then around the bottom of your passenger car seat or your car seat with a piece of elastic. Now all of the sizes that you have can be changed, so if you've got a smaller seat or you wanted to make this larger, then that is entirely up to you. But this is a pretty standard size, so I think if you don't want to make one to measure, then this is going to be fine for the back of your car seat. So let's have a look at the materials that we need and then we'll get sewing. The fabric pocket is made from a piece of fabric measuring 19 inches by 14 inches. So take the rectangle and fold it in half, and then I've simply trimmed away 2.5 inches from each side here. So the rectangle of fabric would have been this big originally. The elastic is going to go in a channel across the top here, and that's going to make your elasticated gathered pocket. So the easiest way to put your elastic in there is to open out your fabric, place the elastic across the crease line. You can see the elastic is longer than my fabric, and then I'm going to sew just over the end here just to secure it. So make sure that that elastic is tucked right into the crease mark. And then I'm going to sew, keeping the elastic again tucked underneath the crease. I can feel where that is, and I'm going to sew just underneath the elastic all the way across here. But be careful not to sew through the elastic because we need to pull it up. So as you're sewing, just keep making sure that the elastic is pushed into the crease, so take your time. And when you get to the other end, leave the elastic loose. So that's how you're going to be able to gather it. I've already fused my foam to the wrong side of my outer fabric. And as you can see, I've used my circle template just to round off the top 2 corners. So there's the foam on the back and there's my fabric. I'm going to sew the bottom of the pocket right sides together like so to make a tube. So just sew across this part. Then we'll turn the whole thing the right side out and press. Then it's going to go onto the back of my organiser. So place the pocket centrally and squarely, just to make sure that that's straight. I'm going to put my ruler underneath there. You could pop a couple of pins in there if you wish. The foam is quite thick to pin through, so if you've got fabric clips that may be easier for you. And sew straight across the bottom. And we're going to take the end of the pocket where I've fixed the elastic and bend this so that the raw edges meet along the pocket and the back of the organiser. And I'm just going to sew this within the seam allowance just to tack it in place. So that's how we're looking. The next thing to do is to take the loose elastic and pull this together. Try and make sure those gathers are even all the way across, and just keep pulling until the width of the fabric at the top is the same as the width of the back. So I can just move that fabric out there. I'm going to pop a clip in here to hold that for now, and then just measure to make sure that the tops of the pockets are the same distance from the bottom of my organiser. Perfect. So now I can sew down this second side, and then I'll organise these gathers to make them even. So this time I'm going to sew straight across the elastic, and that's going to secure the end of it, and all the way down the pocket. Now if I have a little bit of extra fabric at the end, as I have here, I can trim this back and trim off the elastic. And the same on this side. Now let's organise these ruffles so that they're spaced nice and evenly. And then I'll need to draw and then sew a dividing line right down the centre of the pocket. So measure and mark the halfway mark, and a nice straight line straight across the pocket with an erasable marker pen. So I'm going to stretch the pocket out so it's nice and flat, and then sew down this line, but over the top of the elastic here, go backwards and forwards a couple of times, and that's going to make sure you've got a nice strong seam. So if you put anything quite bulky in the pockets, then it's not going to tear. So that's my two pockets finished. Now let's make the vinyl pocket. I've already put some bias binding onto the top of my vinyl. So this again is cut to the width, or slightly larger than the width of your panel, because I'm just going to put a couple of tiny pleats in the bottom of that just to give it a little bit of depth. Bias binding across the top, and then I'll need to put bias binding across the bottom, but I'm not going to sew it all the way across at the moment, because there's going to be a little gap in the side so that I can put my my charger in there, but I want the stitches across the bottom to look like one continual line. That'll make sense in just a minute. So I'm just adding a little bit of glue from a glue stick to help hold this in place. These things are invaluable. On the Create and Craft website, have a look for sticks too. They do a lovely fabric glue stick. And make sure your glue sticks are for fabric, because I'm going to sew through this and I don't want to gunge up my needle. These fabric glue sticks have been designed to work with fabric, so it's not going to damage my sewing machine. I've already pressed, you might have noticed, the bias binding in half. So now I'm just going to wrap it around the edge of the vinyl. Vinyl can be notoriously difficult to sew through, which is why I've got the bias binding on both sides. So I don't need a special presser foot, I don't need to use a non-stick foot. I just need to be careful, I'll show you that in a second, that the vinyl doesn't drag on the bed of my sewing machine. Okay, so let's make that a little bit straighter. Like so. So all I'm going to do here is to sew a little section which is where the gap's going to be, just to one side. So leave about 1.5 inches and sew about 1.5 inches just across here. Now when you're sewing your vinyl, it's not going to stick to the foot or the throat of my sewing machine, it'll stick to this bit here. So just lift it up so that it's not actually touching the sewing machine, and you'll get the best result. And just sew a little way across there. The pocket then sits just above the fabric pocket. Oops. So just touching the top, make sure it's square. So the edges of the vinyl are here, I don't know if you can quite see that. And then just to make a little bit of dimension, I'm going to put 2 little pleats in the fabric section here. And I'm just going to stab a pin straight into the foam to hold it in place. And the same on this side, measure and mark it to make it perfectly symmetrical if you wish. But again, just a tiny pleat, and I'm just drawing the side of the vinyl in so that it is the same width as the pocket. And stab a pin. And then we'll sew across here up to where I've already sewn, leave a gap, and then carry on sewing. So that's where my stitch line will look like one continual line, but there is actually a gap underneath there. So that's how we're looking. What I'm also going to do is just to put a few stitches at the top of the pocket to hold it in place. And if your vinyl is still wider than the actual pocket, I can then trim it down. So remember, I've got a little crease in there, so I just want to add the depth before I sew. Just across the top will hold it fine. That's all we need. And then the same on this side. So just keep the depth, sew in place. And then let's trim this away. Now because we've got a little bit of a gusset or a depth to the pocket, at the moment, if you put something heavy in there, it's all going to fall forward. So even with the straps that are holding it at the top, if you put something like a tablet in there, it will fall forward. So what I'd suggest you do is to put your tablet in here now. So say it's about this big, and then just put a couple of stitches in the top here, and then that'll stop the whole thing falling forward. So just through the bias binding. If you're not putting a tablet in here but you've still got the clear pocket, you can still, if you wanted to, make dividing lines going down there. Or try it out. If you're using this for something quite lightweight, you might not need to stitch through here at all. This is what I mean about making it bespoke, so that it suits you perfectly. Let's just snip off those threads. Right, now the pockets are practically finished. So all we need to do now is to add the ribbon and the elastic. So take your ribbon piece, fold each one of them in half, and then we're going to sew the folded side facing down centrally to the top of the cover. So I'll just measure and mark that. So there's the centre. And these should be 7 inches apart. That's how I measured them on my car seat. So these are going to sit directly underneath the stems on your headrests. So it might be worth having a measure of your car and just see exactly where they're going to fit. Okay, then I'm going to sew those just to hold them in place. And then the elastic goes around the bottom. So this again needs to be facing inwards. So clip onto both sides. Try and make sure it's not twisted, but it's not vitally important. The same distance from the bottom. And then just like with the ribbon, I'm just going to sew over the ends to secure them. Right, now I'm going to put the elastic and the ribbon out of the way. I've just tucked those inside the pockets for now. And we'll put the backing fabric on. So facing downwards, so the wrong side is up. I'm now going to use my fabric spray, 505, use a lot of it, to adhere the outside of the cover to the backing. So keep the spray away from your sewing machine and put a mat or some paper or something underneath where you're spraying, because it does get very sticky. So that goes on here. Let's smooth it out from the back. I'll iron that later. Make sure there's no wrinkles and crinkles. And then cut it to the same size as the front. I find that the easiest way of cutting out the lining, so I know that it's going to fit perfectly. And then on goes the bias binding. Now I'm going to sew the first part of the tape from the back. Normally with projects, no matter what I'm making, I like to hand sew it. So I'll sew the first half of the bias tape to the front of my project, then wrap it over to the back and hand sew it. Because you're never going to see the back of this, I don't mind machine sewing. The reason I don't machine sew both sides of the tape normally is because trying to get the top stitch perfectly straight underneath where you can't see it can be quite tricky. That will make sense in a minute when we start sewing. So the idea is to apply the tape first from the back, wrap it over, and then machine top stitch from the front. So fold over the end of your bias tape by about 1/2 inch or so, and I'm going to start in the middle of the bottom, and I'm going to sew the tape edge to edge all the way around. So I'm just sewing in the first crease line. Make sure that the ribbon and the elastic are tucked out of the way when it comes to them. And I'm going to miter into the corner. So stop sewing 1/4 inch from the edge. So the distance between the edge of my bias binding and that crease is the distance that I'm going to stop from this side. Turn this over, flip the fabric around, there you go, so that I have like a triangle of fabric in the centre here, and then carry on sewing down the second side. And we'll do that in the second corner as well. Gives it a nice square finish to your work. Now when I come back to the beginning, I've just overlapped the ends of the bias binding, and that'll give a nice neat finish. So that's how we're looking at the moment. So the next thing we need to do is to fold the tape over the edge. Now when you fold this over, just got a thread, and another one. The tape should cover your existing stitch line. So if it doesn't quite, and I've got an extra little bit of vinyl sticking out there, trim this fabric back. Don't cut through your bias binding, I've folded that out of the way, but I can just trim this back, and that makes it neater. Same on the curves. If you find some of the curves are a little bit bulky, then there's no harm in trimming this back. That's okay. A little bit here needs coming off. That's fine. So now I'm going to sew all the way around again. I can use a longer stitch on my machine this time because this is just a decorative stitch. It doesn't have to be strong. And we'll fold the edge over and then top stitch all the way around here. And this is what I meant about putting the bias tape on the back and folding it to the front. So now on the bit that I can see, which is obviously the front, I know that I've got a really nice straight line. And if on the back the stitches don't follow exactly the seam around here, it doesn't really matter too much because nobody's going to see the back. So let's fold this over, needle down, and sew. Let's just trim away any loose ends I have remaining. And there's my pocket finished. All ready to go on the back of my car seat. It's like an entertainment station for kids, isn't it? And remember, I've still got that little gap underneath the side here that I can put my charger through so I don't have wires all over the place. So I hope you've enjoyed the tutorial, and I hope you enjoy making yours.